It is a Saturday morning in 1966, and you're standing at the threshold of the future, the automatic doors of a newly opened Tesco or Fine Fare. Inside, the air smells of industrial floor wax and fresh cardboard, and the fluorescent lights hum with a dazzling brightness that makes the old corner shop look like a dim cave. In your handbag, tucked safely inside a leather purse, sits a single piece of paper that feels as valuable as a gold bar. It is a crisp, green £1 note. It isn't a piece of loose change rattling in your pocket. It is a substantial, serious promissory note from the Bank of England. You pick up a wire basket, a novelty in itself, and step into the aisles. You're about to perform a magic trick that seems impossible to the modern mind. With this single green note, you're not just going to buy a snack. You're going to fill the basket, you're going to buy meat, dairy, bread, and tea, and you are still going to expect change. Welcome to the golden age of the British pound. To appreciate the staggering power of that pound note, we have to look at the world it was slowly dismantling. For centuries, the British high street had remained largely unchanged. Shopping wasn't a one-stop chore, it was a pilgrimage. You didn't just go to the shops. You went to the butcher, the baker, the greengrocer, and the fishmonger. It was a fragmented, slow, and deeply social ritual that consumed half a day. In the early 1960s, the counter was still king. You walked into the grocer's, and you were separated from the goods by a solid wooden barrier and a man in a brown coat. You couldn't touch the merchandise, you had to ask for it. A quarter of tea. Please, Mr. Jones. He would weigh it out from a chest, pour it into a blue paper bag, and twist the corners with a flourish that took years to master. Butter wasn't a foil-wrapped brick. It was a giant yellow mound that was sliced with wire and patted into shape with wooden paddles before being wrapped in grease-proof paper. Money worked differently here, too. This was the era of the slate, or the tick. If it was a Thursday and payday wasn't until Friday, you didn't go hungry. The shopkeeper simply wrote your name in a ledger and added the cost to your tally. It was an informal credit system built entirely on trust and shame. You paid up on Friday because if you didn't, the whole street would know by Saturday morning. It was inefficient, yes. You queued 4 times for 4 different things. But it was personal. The shopkeeper knew your children's names, your husband's job, and exactly how you liked your bacon sliced. But the winds of change were blowing across the Atlantic, bringing with them a concept that would destroy this intimate world forever: self-service. The arrival of the supermarket in Britain wasn't just a change in retail, it was a cultural shockwave imported directly from the United States. When the first large-scale self-service stores, like Tesco, founded by the legendary Jack Cohen, or the glitzy new Fine Fare markets, began to open their doors in the high streets, they were viewed with a mixture of excitement and deep suspicion. To the British housewife, accustomed to being waited on by a man in an apron, the concept of self-service felt alien, almost rude. There was a psychological barrier to overcome. For generations, touching the goods before you bought them was considered bad manners, or worse, shoplifting. Now, suddenly, you were expected to walk in through a metal turnstile, pick up a cold wire basket, and help yourself. Early supermarket managers actually reported women standing frozen in the aisles, waiting for someone to hand them a tin of beans, unable to break the habit of a lifetime. But once the hesitation vanished, it was replaced by a dizzying sense of liberation. The supermarket was a theater of abundance. The shelves were stacked from floor to ceiling, following Jack Cohen's famous mantra: "Pile it high, sell it cheap." The lighting was bright and clinical. The music, piped-in music, was designed to lull you into a spending trance. This was also the birth of the impulse buy. In the old grocers, you bought what was on your list because you had to ask for it out loud. You wouldn't dare ask for a luxury item if you were on a tight budget and the neighbors were listening. But in the supermarket, Nobody was judging your basket. You could slip a packet of chocolate biscuits or a tin of exotic fruit in between the flour and the lard, and no one would know until you reached the checkout. The architecture of the store was designed to manipulate. The essentials, the bread, the milk, the meat, were strategically placed at the back of the store, forcing you to walk past the luxuries to get to them. The special offers were stacked in pyramids at the end of the aisles, screaming for attention with fluorescent star-shaped signs. It was a new, aggressive form of consumerism. We traded the slow, chatty warmth of the counter for the silent, ruthless efficiency of the aisle. The slate was gone. Cash was king. And standing at the checkout, listening to the mechanical kerching of the till, the British shopper realized that while they had gained choice and speed, they had lost the conversation. The high street was no longer a community hub. It was a hunting ground, and with that green pound note in your hand, you were the prey. So, let us perform the autopsy of that green pound note. To understand its power, you first have to speak the language of old money. This was the era of LSD, libre, solidi, denari. There were 20 shillings in a pound and 12 pennies in a shilling. That meant you had 240 pennies in your pocket. It sounds complicated now, but to a 1960s housewife, it was second nature. She could calculate the change from a 10-bob note faster than a modern computer. First into the wire basket goes the bread. In the 1960s, the national loaf was a memory, replaced by the sliced white miracle of mother's pride or sun-blessed. It came in a wax paper wrapper that felt greasy to the touch. It wasn't artisan sourdough. It was soft, square, blindingly white, and perfect for toast. A large loaf cost about 1 shilling and 3 pence. One's 3D. Next, the dairy. A pound of New Zealand anchor butter, hard, yellow and salty, would set you back around 3 shillings, 3 seers. Margarine, stork, was cheaper and often used for baking, but if you had a pound note, you were splashing out on the real stuff for the table. Then, a dozen eggs. In the 60s, we didn't worry about free range or organic. They were just eggs, stamped with the British lion mark to prove they were fresh. That's another 4 shillings. 4s. Then came the national fuel, tea. In the mid-60s, tea bags were still a novelty viewed with suspicion by the older generation. Real tea came as loose leaves in a square packet, Brook Bond Dividend or PG Tips. You collected the picture cards inside the box. Birds, flowers, or flags. A quarter-pound packet cost about 1 shilling and 9 pence. One's 9D. Finally, the milk. While the milkman delivered the daily pints to the doorstep in the freezing dawn, you always grabbed an extra bottle at the shop for emergencies. A pint of full cream milk with the silver foil top and the layer of cream inches thick at the neck that you had to shake in cost just 9 pence. 9D. Let's do the maths. We have bought a large loaf, a pound of butter, a dozen eggs, a quarter of tea, and a pint of milk. The total, 10 shillings and 9 pence. You have half filled a basket with the fundamental staples of life, and you haven't even broken the 10-shilling mark. You still have nearly half your pound note left. In today's money, that remaining change feels like a fortune. You still have enough left for meat, for tins, and perhaps even the most essential item of the 1960s working man, tobacco. With the essentials secured and almost 10 shillings still burning a hole in your pocket, you could turn your attention to the luxuries, or what passed for luxuries in the 1960s. The supermarket shelves were beginning to fill with modern foods, products that promised a taste of the exotic without the effort. First, the tin opener's delight, John West red salmon. A tin of this was the height of sophistication, usually reserved for Sunday tea sandwiches with the crusts cut off. It cost around 2 shillings and 6 pence, 2.6d. Then, perhaps a Vesta beef curry. This was the 60s idea of international cuisine, a flat box containing dehydrated beef granules and curry powder that you boiled in a bag. It was futuristic, it was exciting, and it cost 2 shillings to our size. And for the smoker, which was almost every adult male and a fair few females, the price of tobacco was a revelation compared to today. A packet of 20 Woodbines or Player's Navy cut cost around 4 shillings and 4s. Today, that same packet costs nearly $15. In the 1960s, smoking was a cheap habit, integrated into every part of life, from the cinema to the hospital waiting room. However, what is striking about a 1960s supermarket basket is not just what was in it, but what was missing. The fresh produce section was a barren landscape by modern standards. There were no avocados, no red peppers, no courgettes, no aubergines. The fruit and veg aisle was seasonal and strictly British. In winter, it was a parade of root vegetables, muddy potatoes, turnips, carrots, and perhaps some Brussels sprouts. If you wanted fruit, you bought apples or pears, or, more likely, you bought it in a tin. A tin of Del Monte fruit cocktail, suspended in heavy syrup, was a treat. Fresh strawberries in December were unheard of. Olive oil was sold in tiny 2-oz bottles in the chemist, strictly for medicinal use to soften earwax. Buying it to cook with would have marked you out as a dangerous eccentric. The 1960s basket was heavy on starch, sugar, and fat, and completely devoid of the global variety we take for granted. It was a diet of meat and 2 veg, where the veg was boiled to submission, and the only spice came from a bottle of HP sauce. But the transaction didn't end when you handed over the cash. As the till rang up the total, the cashier would perform one final, crucial ritual. She would reach for a dispenser and tear off a long, perforated strip of green gummed paper. These were Green Shield stamps, and for a decade, they were arguably the second currency of the United Kingdom. The system was genius in its simplicity. For every shilling you spent, you were given a stamp. It turned the mundane act of buying beans and bread into a treasure hunt. You didn't just shove them in your pocket, you guarded them. If a cashier forgot to give them to you, you asked for them. If you saw a strip dropped on the pavement, you picked it up as if it were a 5-pound note. The real obsession, however, happened back at home. On a Friday night after the tea things were cleared away, the kitchen table would be covered with Savor books. The entire family would get involved in the sticky, repetitive task of licking the stamps and pasting them into the grids. The taste of that glue, a peculiar, slightly bitter flavor, is a sensory memory that is etched onto the tongue of everyone who grew up in the 60s or 70s. Some families used a damp sponge in a saucer, but most used good old-fashioned spit. Why did we do it? We did it for the catalog. The Green Shield stamp catalog was the Book of Dreams for the working class. It was a glossy manifesto of aspiration. It promised that if you just bought enough groceries, you could transform your life for free. It created a direct link between the tin of soup you ate on Tuesday and the luxury item you dreamed of owning on Sunday. A new electric toaster might cost you 3 full books. A set of garden chairs might be 10. For the truly dedicated, the super savers who collected for years, there was the mythical mini-car, which cost thousands of books. I'm not sure anyone actually ever got the car, but we all knew someone who almost had enough. It was a brilliant psychological trick. It made us loyal to specific shops, not because their prices were the best, but because they gave us those little green squares of hope. If the 1960s was the golden age of the pound, the curtain fell with a brutal, crashing finality on February 15th, 1971. This was D-Day, Decimalisation Day. It remains perhaps the single biggest psychological shift in the history of British commerce, a day when the entire nation effectively had to learn a foreign language overnight. For centuries, the British mind had been wired to think in base 12. 12 pennies to a shilling, 20 shillings to a pound. It was a system that dated back to the Romans. It was eccentric, yes, but it worked. We knew that a sixpence, a tanner, could buy you a chocolate bar and a bus ride. We knew the weight of a half-crown. We understood the rhythm of the coins. Then, at the stroke of midnight, it was swept away. The government decided to align with the modern world. The pound remained, but it was now divided into 100 new pence. The shilling was dead. The florin was dead. The penny, the heavy, copper disc that felt like it had real value, was replaced by a tiny, bronze token that felt like toy money. The chaos in the supermarkets was absolute. For weeks, elderly ladies stood at checkouts, weeping, clutching handfuls of strange coins, terrified they were being ripped off. Shop assistants, equally confused, frantically consulted conversion charts hanging from the tills to work out how much 360 was in new pence, 1712p if you were lucky. But the real trauma wasn't the confusion, it was the suspicion. The British public was convinced, and arguably right, that decimalisation was the great robbery. The belief was universal. Shopkeepers had used the confusion to round up the prices. If an item was 11 old pennies, it didn't become 412 new pence. It quietly became 5 new pence. It seemed small, a halfpenny here, a penny there, but across a weekly shop, it was a landslide. The new money felt lighter, faster, and slippery. The psychological anchor had been cut. A pound note, which in 1966 had felt like a fortress of value, suddenly seemed to dissolve. The trust between the shopper and the shopkeeper, already damaged by the move to self-service, was finally severed. We weren't just swapping coins, we were watching the purchasing power of the 1960s evaporate before our eyes. The era of the 10-bob note buying a round of drinks was over. The inflation of the 1970s was knocking at the door, and the pound would never feel heavy in our pockets again. If decimalisation was the initial robbery, the decade that followed was the getaway car speeding away with the nation's wealth. The 1970s arrived not with the optimism of the swinging 60s, but with a grey, creeping malaise that ate away at the very foundations of British life. Inflation. For the shopper who had marvelled at the purchasing power of their pound note in 1966, the 1970s was a waking nightmare. The stability of prices, something the British had taken for granted for decades, vanished. In 1975 alone, inflation hit a terrifying peak of 24%. It created a new, stressful ritual in the supermarket aisles. You didn't just check the price, you checked the layers of the price. Shoppers would pick up a tin of beans or a packet of tea and find 3 or 4 orange price stickers stacked on top of each other, each one higher than the last. The staff couldn't peel the old ones off fast enough. The sound of the pricing gun, click-clack, click-clack, became the soundtrack of the store. A machine gun rhythm announcing that your wages were worth less today than they were yesterday. This was the era when the pound in your pocket, a phrase made famous by Prime Minister Harold Wilson in a broadcast trying to reassure the nation, became a bitter joke. He had promised that devaluation wouldn't affect the pound in the ordinary man's pocket. He was wrong. The pound note, once a substantial sheet of green paper that commanded respect, began to feel flimsy. It started to be treated like loose change. You no longer pulled it out to pay for a weekly shop. You pulled out a handful of them just to buy the basics. And as the money bought less, the goods themselves began to physically change. This was the dawn of shrinkflation, though we didn't have a name for it then. We just had a collective suspicion that the world was getting smaller. The most famous casualty, the subject of heated debate in every pub in Britain, was the wagon wheel. In the 1960s, a wagon wheel was a majestic, dinner plate-sized biscuit. It felt enormous in a child's hand. By the mid-70s, it seemed to have shrunk. The manufacturers swore it was just that our hands were getting bigger, but we knew. The Mars bar got lighter, the curly-whirly got shorter. The tin of Rose's chocolates, once a heavy metal drum that could be used to store cakes for decades afterwards, transformed into a smaller cardboard box. We were paying more for less. The abundance of the 1960s supermarket, the feeling that you could fill a trolley without thinking, was replaced by a cautious, calculator-led anxiety. Mothers walked round with a mental tally running in their heads, putting the luxury biscuits back on the shelf because the price of sugar had doubled overnight. The dream of the consumer paradise had soured. We had the supermarkets, we had the choice, but we no longer had the means to enjoy them without worry. So, let us fast forward 60 years to the present day. If you walked into a supermarket this morning, perhaps a giant Tesco Extra or an Aldi, clutching a single, modern £1 coin, what would it get you? The answer is a sobering lesson in economic history. That £1 coin, which replaced the green note in 1983 because the note was disintegrating too quickly from overuse, is now essentially pocket money. In the 1960s, your pound bought a basket of bread, butter, milk, tea, eggs, and meat. Today, it might buy you a single litre of milk, or a loaf of the cheapest value-range bread, or perhaps, if you are lucky, a single chocolate bar. But if you tried to replicate the 1966 basket, a pound of butter today is nearly 2.0 hours. A dozen eggs, 3.5 hours. The tea, the meat, the cheese. To fill that same wire basket today would cost you upwards of $20 or $30. The value has eroded by over 95%. However, there is a paradox here that is often missed in the haze of nostalgia. While the prices have skyrocketed, the affordability of food has actually improved. In the 1960s, food was expensive relative to wages. The average family spent nearly 30% of their weekly income just on feeding themselves. It was the biggest bill after the rent. Today, we spend closer to 10% or 15%. We have become a nation of cheap food. We expect strawberries in January. We expect chickens to cost $3. We have traded the high value we once placed on food for an abundance of choice and convenience that would have terrified a 1960s housewife. She had to budget carefully for a Sunday roast because it was a significant financial event. We can buy a ready-roasted chicken on a Tuesday for less than the price of a pint of beer. So, while we mourn the loss of the purchasing power of the pound, we must also recognize what we have gained. We have a global pantry. We have spices. We have pasta. We have fruit from the other side of the world. But we have lost something too. We have lost the respect for the ingredients. When a block of butter cost a significant slice of your weekly wage, you didn't waste a scrap of it. You scraped the wrapper. You respected the cost. Today, in our era of buy one get one free, food has become disposable. We throw away millions of tons of it, something that would have been a moral crime in the era of the green pound note. There is a specific, quiet melancholy in looking at a photograph of an old Series C £1 note. With its intricate swirls, the portrait of the young queen, and its crisp, green dignity, it looks more like a certificate of achievement than a piece of currency. It represents a time when money had a physical weight, and spending it was a deliberate act. We live today in a world of tap to pay. Money has become invisible. It is a digital number on a screen, whisked away with the wave of a card or a phone. We spend without feeling it. We fill our trolleys with a casual abandon that would have stunned our grandmothers, tossing in items we might never even eat. We have achieved the ultimate convenience, but in the process, we have detached ourselves from the value of the things that keep us alive. The 1960s supermarket, for all its primitive simplicity, was a place of conscious choice. When you handed over that green note, you were making a trade you understood. You felt the exchange. You knew exactly how many hours of work that block of cheese represented. It bred a culture of respect. Respect for the food, respect for the shopkeeper, and respect for the household budget. We often look back at the past and pity the lack of choice. We think of the limited range of vegetables, the lack of spices, and the reliance on tinned goods. and we feel superior. But were we really poorer? We may have had less in our baskets, but we appreciated it more. A tin of salmon was a feast. A block of real butter was a luxury to be savored. Perhaps that is the true difference between the shopper of 1966 and the shopper of today. We have the price of everything, but we are in danger of knowing the value of nothing. We have swapped the green shield stamp and the green pound note for a world of infinite abundance, yet we often leave the supermarket feeling strangely empty. So, the next time you tap your card for a $3 coffee without blinking, spare a thought for the green note that once fed a family for a week. It is a ghost from a simpler time, reminding us that sometimes less really was more.